The umbilical hissed, a wet, ragged sound that shouldn't exist 500 feet below the surface of the Gulf. My Kirby Morgan mask was fogging, the recirculator tasting like cold pennies and recycled fear. Topside check, I grunted, the words vibrating against my teeth. Silence. Not the usual crackle of the comms or the hum of the rig's generators, but a heavy, pressurized silence that felt like it was trying to crush my skull. I checked my wrist gauge. 5:02. The darkness out here, past the halo of my torch, wasn't just water, it was a thick, viscous ink that swallowed light and hope in equal measure. Then came the thud. Something heavy hit the top of the welding habitat. Not a tool. Not a piece of debris. It was a rhythmic, frantic scratching, like a dog trying to dig through concrete. I looked up at the thick acrylic viewport, and my heart stopped. A face was pressed against the glass. It was Miller, the deckhand who just bolted the hatch an hour ago. But his eyes were blown out, milky white, and his jaw was hanging at an impossible angle. Skin peeling away in gray ribbons as the pressure began to liquefy his insides. He wasn't breathing. He was screaming, a silent, bubbly gale of gore that clouded the water around his head. He shouldn't be here. Without a suit, the pressure at this depth should have flattened him into a pancake in milliseconds. Instead, he was clawing at the glass, his fingernails snapping off and floating away like tiny white petals. That's when the second body drifted past, then a third. A rain of corpses was falling from the rig above, a slow-motion cascade of the damned sinking into the abyss. They weren't drowning. They were reaching. I swung my welding torch, the arc cutting a blinding blue scar through the silt. The light revealed dozens of them, suspended in the water column like jellyfish made of rot. They were caught in the rig's structure, their limbs twitching with a frantic, mindless hunger. My oxygen alarm blared, a shrill, mocking beep that told me I had 10 minutes of gas left before I'd have to join them. I looked at the umbilical cord, the lifeline that connected me to the deep water horizon to above. It was severed. The jagged ends were frayed, swinging in the current like a dead man's noose. I was 500 feet down, trapped in a steel bubble, and the world above had turned into a slaughterhouse. I grabbed the emergency pony bottle, my movements jerky and fueled by pure adrenaline. Every instinct told me to blow my ballast and rocket to the surface. But the bends would turn my blood into boiling foam before I hit the 100-foot mark. I had to get to the saturation bell. If I could reach the bell, I could seal myself in, but the hatch was outside. I'd have to swim through the cloud of them. I felt a vibration through the deck plates, a heavy, metallic groan. The rig was tilting. Something massive was failing up top. If that platform came down, it would pancake this habitat into the seabed, and I'd be buried in a tomb of Louisiana sweet crude and twisted steel. I hauled myself toward the airlock, my boots clunking on the metal grate. Through the portside window, I saw a shape larger than the rest. It wasn't a body. It was a great white, but it wasn't hunting. It was being eaten. 3 of those things were latched onto its flanks, their teeth buried deep in the shark's sandpaper skin, ignoring the massive thrashing of the predator. They were relentless. They didn't feel pain, and they didn't need to breathe. My hand hit the airlock lever. As the outer door creaked open, a hand, blue-gray and bloated, reached in from the dark. I didn't think. I slammed the heavy welding lead into the creature's forehead. It didn't crunch, it squelched. The thing didn't even flinch, its fingers catching the cuff of my dive suit. I kicked, my heavy lead boots connecting with its chest, sending it spiraling back into the void. I was in the transfer chamber, but I wasn't alone. The internal comms sputtered to life. Is someone there? It was Sarah, the medic from the SAT chamber. Her voice was a ragged edge of a scream. "Don't come up," she whispered, the sound of breaking glass in the background. "They're in the vents. They're in the walls." "Captain?" The captain ate his own hands. "Jack? He's still chewing." The realization hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't just a rig accident. This wasn't a gas leak. It was everywhere. If the crew on a high-security offshore rig was gone, then the coast, New Orleans, Houston, Mobile, was already a graveyard. I looked at the depth gauge. I had to decompress. It would take days to get the nitrogen out of my blood. Days trapped in a steel can while the dead scratched at the walls. I started the pressurization sequence, the scream of the gas filling the small room. I watched through the tiny interior porthole as the lights on the rig above began to flicker and die, one by one, leaving me in the absolute crushing dark of the Gulf. My name is Jack, and I'm a deep-sea welder. I'm currently 500 feet below the waves, and I think I'm the last man alive in the Gulf of Mexico. But the scratching on the hatch is getting louder, and I just noticed a leak in the overhead seal. It's not water coming through. It's dark, infected blood. I grabbed a pipe wrench, my knuckles white. The air felt thick, heavy with the scent of ozone and something sweet, like rotting peaches. Sarah's voice cut out into a wet, gurgling sound over the radio. Then, a new sound started. A rhythmic thumping from the bell's docking port. Asterisk thud. 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 Asterisk someone was trying to manually override the hatch from the outside. I looked at the monitor. It was the ROV, the remote-operated vehicle. But no one was piloting it from the surface. The camera feed flickered, showing the mechanical arm of the drone methodically punching the keypad. Behind the ROV, the water was teeming. Thousands of them, attracted by the light and the noise, were sinking toward me like a shroud. I realized then that the pressure hadn't killed them because they were already dead. Their lungs didn't need air, their blood didn't need oxygen. They were the perfect deep-sea predators. I had to make a choice. Die in this tin can as the pressure slowly crushed it. Or take the diving bell and pray the emergency thrusters could get me to the surface before the rig collapsed. I lunged for the controls, my hands shaking so hard I could barely flip the toggles. The bell groaned as it disconnected from the habitat. A sudden jolt threw me against the wall as the rig above shifted again. A massive support cable snapped, whipping through the water and slicing through a cluster of the sunken dead like a scythe. I felt the bell begin to rise, the buoyancy tanks screaming as they filled with air. But I wasn't going up alone. Through the bottom hatch viewport I saw them. They had latched onto the exterior of the bell. Dozens of them, their pale, bloated bodies clinging to the steel, their dead eyes staring through the glass at me. We were ascending together. The pressure began to drop. 450 feet. 400 feet. The bodies outside started to change. The gases in their tissues began to expand. Their skin bubbled and tore, but they didn't let go. They were hitching a ride to the world of the living. I grabbed the emergency flare gun, though I knew it was useless in here. I just needed something to hold. At 300 feet, the rig finally gave way. A massive, muffled explosion rocked the water, the shockwave nearly flipping the bell. The deep-water horizon too was coming down. I watched the massive shadow of the platform descend into the gloom, a billion-dollar tomb for everyone I'd worked with for the last 6 months. It missed the bell by inches, the turbulence spinning me like a top. When the world stopped shaking, I looked up. The surface was a shimmering, broken mirror of orange and red. The sky was on fire. I broke the surface with a violent surge, the bell bobbing in the swells of the Gulf. I scrambled to the small upper viewport, gasping for breath as I looked out. The horizon wasn't dark. It was a line of burning orange. Ships, tankers, supply boats, private yachts, were all adrift, plumes of black smoke rising into the humid Louisiana air. The rig's distress lights were the only thing keeping the dark at bay. And then I heard it. Not the wind. Not the waves. A low, collective moan drifting across the water from the nearest supply ship, the Sea Venture. It was only 50 yards away, its decks swarming with movement. I reached for the radio, my voice a ghost. Mayday, mayday. This is Jack Brennan from the DH2. Is anyone out there? A voice crackled back, faint and distorted. Don't come shore. The cities, they're gone. Stay in the water. The line went dead. I looked back down at the bottom hatch. The scratching hadn't stopped. They were still on the bell. And they were starting to climb up the sides toward the top hatch. I was a sitting duck in a floating coffin, 5 miles from a coast that was currently being eaten alive. I reached for the manual release, my heart hammering against my ribs. I had to get to the Sea Venture. It was my only chance at a boat with enough fuel to get me to the islands. But as I looked at the ship, I saw someone standing on the bridge wing, looking at me through binoculars. They weren't a zombie. They were holding a rifle. And they weren't aiming at the things in the water. They were aiming at me. A bullet starred the thick glass of the viewport, right next to my head. Stay back. A megaphone blared from the ship. We aren't taking any more of you. Get away or we'll sink you. I was caught between a world of monsters and a world of desperate men who had become something worse. I looked at the depth gauge one last time. It was 0. I had survived the depths, but the real nightmare was just beginning. The bell tilted sharply as 3 of the creatures hauled themselves onto the top deck, their wet, gray hands fumbling with the hatch seal. I had a pipe wrench, a flare gun, and a deep-sea diving suit that was never meant for land. The hatch seal hissed. The first one was coming in. I stood up, braced my feet against the curved walls, and waited for the light to hit its eyes. Welcome to the party, you son of a bitch, I whispered, and swung with everything I had. The pipe wrench didn't just hit the thing, it erased the geometry of its face. There was no satisfying crunch of bone, only the wet, heavy thud of a tool meeting a sponge soaked in seawater and rot. The creature, it had been a deckhand once, wearing a salt-stained jumpsuit that hung off its emaciated frame, collapsed backward. Its skull caved in like a rusted hull. But the momentum of its fall didn't clear the hatch. Its bloated, gray fingers remained hooked over the rim of the bell. And the 2 things behind it were already clawing over its twitching torso to get at me. The air inside the bell, which had been stale and metallic for days, was suddenly overwhelmed by the stench of the surface world. A cocktail of diesel fumes, copper-heavy blood, and the unmistakable, sweet cloying rot of 1,000 unburied bodies baking under the Gulf sun. I didn't have time to gag. I kicked the first corpse in the chest, my heavy diving boot connecting with a sickening squelch, sending it tumbling back into the churning water between the bell and the ship's hull. The second one was faster. It lunged, its teeth snapping inches from the faceplate of my helmet. I didn't have room to swing the wrench again. I grabbed the flare gun from the equipment rack, jammed the muzzle into the creature's open maw, and pulled the trigger. The roar in the confined space of the bell was deafening. A blinding magnesium flash turned the world white. The zombie didn't just die, its head turned into a localized sun, white-hot phosphorus melting through gristle and bone in a spray of liquid fire. It fell back, a headless torch illuminating the chaos on the deck of the Undine. I scrambled out of the hatch, my movements heavy and agonizingly slow. In the water, I was weightless, a master of buoyancy. On land, clad in a pressurized deep-sea suit designed to withstand the crushing weight of 500 feet of ocean, I was a 300-pound metal golem. Every step was a battle against gravity and my own fatigue. I hauled myself onto the deck, the metal plating slick with a mixture of sea spray and dark, viscous gore. The sunlight hit me like a physical blow. After weeks in the twilight of the abyss, the midday sun was a blinding, merciless god. My eyes burned, weeping behind the glass, but I couldn't stop. Get back! The megaphone screamed again. A second bullet hammered into the shoulder of my suit, the impact spinning me halfway around. The Kevlar-reinforced layering held, but the force bruised the hell out of my collarbone. I looked up toward the bridge. A man in a stained officer's cap was leaning over the railing, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. He wasn't looking at me anymore. He was looking behind me. I turned my heavy helmet, the gears in the neck ring grinding with the effort. The Undine was a graveyard. The deck was littered with bodies, some moving, most not. But it wasn't the zombies that were the immediate problem. It was the sound. A low, rhythmic thumping was coming from the ship's internal structure, a groan of stressed metal that I knew all too well. The moon pool cables! I hissed, my voice cracking in the dry air of my helmet. The bell was still attached to the winch system, but the ship was listing heavily to starboard. The winch was straining, the steel cables humming like guitar strings under thousands of pounds of tension. If those cables snapped, the bell would swing like a wrecking ball, clearing the deck, and me along with it. But that wasn't the worst part. I looked at the digital readout on my wrist gauntlet. My oxygen was fine, but my internal pressure was the ticking clock that would end me. I had come up from 500 feet far too fast. The bell's internal scrubbing system had failed during the ascent, and I hadn't been able to run a proper decompression cycle. Right now, my blood was a shaken soda can. Nitrogen bubbles were already beginning to form in my joints. I could feel the first twinges of the bends, a dull, throbbing ache in my knees and elbows that would soon turn into agonizing, bone-snapping torture. If I didn't get into a professional-grade decompression chamber within the next 15 minutes, my lungs would rupture, and my nervous system would ignite in a final, lethal stroke. I need the sat chamber! I roared, though I knew they couldn't hear me through the thick glass of my helmet. I pointed toward the saturation diving complex at the center of the deck, a series of interconnected steel tubes that looked like a submarine caught in a cage. It was the only place on this ship where I could safely bleed off the pressure killing me from the inside out. The man on the bridge fired again. The bullet hit the deck at my feet, sparking off the steel. "We're full!" He screamed through the megaphone, his voice breaking into a sob. "The chambers are full of the healthy. We don't have room for a ghost. Go back to the water. Die in the dark where you belong." The cruelty of it sparked a cold, hard coal of rage in my chest. Only to find that the sky was guarded by a coward with a rifle. I gripped the pipe wrench. I didn't have 15 minutes. The ache in my joints was sharpening into a stabbing heat. My vision began to tunnel. I took a step toward the bridge, my boots clanking like funeral bells. Behind me, the three creatures I thought I'd cleared weren't alone. More were pulling themselves up over the gunwales, their movements jerky and spider-like. They weren't just the crew. There were people in Hawaiian shirts, children in life vests. A woman in a torn evening gown, the remnants of a cruise ship that must have gone down nearby. They were a tide of gray flesh and hunger, and they were caught between me and the man on the bridge. The man started firing wildly into the crowd of undead. He wasn't a soldier. He was a panicked bureaucrat with a gun he didn't know how to use. He hit 2 of them, but the rest didn't even flinch. They swarmed the stairs leading to the bridge. I saw him realize his mistake too late. He tried to reload, dropped the magazine, and then the tide hit him. His screams were mercifully short, cut off by the sound of wet tearing. I was alone on the main deck now, the ghost in the machine, as the nitrogen bubbles began to migrate toward my brain. Every breath was a struggle against the tightening chest. I stumbled toward the saturation chamber, the heavy iron door of the outer lock standing like the gate to heaven. I reached for the handle, but a hand, blue-veined and cold, clamped onto my gauntlet. I didn't even look. I swung the wrench backward in a blind arc. It connected with something soft, and the pressure on my arm vanished. But then another one was there, and another. They were drawn to the sound of my suit, the hiss of the exhaust valve, the rhythmic thud-thud of my heart. I was a dinner belle in a diving suit. I reached the sat chamber's outer hatch. It was locked from the inside. "Open it!" I screamed, slamming my wrench against the steel. "Open the goddamn door! I'm still human! I'm a diver! I'm bleeding pressure!" Through the small, thick porthole of the chamber door, a face appeared. It was a woman, her eyes wide with a terror that surpassed even the monsters outside. She wasn't a diver. She was a civilian, one of the lucky ones who had made it into the pressurized sanctuary. She looked at me, then at the swarm of undead closing in behind me. She shook her head, her lips moving in a silent sorry, and she reached up to draw a curtain across the glass. The betrayal felt worse than the nitrogen. I was going to die on the threshold of my own salvation because a frightened woman wouldn't turn a handle. The first of the zombies hit my back. It couldn't bite through the suit, but its weight was enough to stagger me. Another grabbed my leg. They were piling on, a mountain of dead weight designed to pin me down. I felt the suit's outer layers begin to groan. The pressure inside the suit was fighting the pressure outside, and if they breached the seals, I wouldn't just be eaten, I'd explode. My lungs felt like they were filled with broken glass. This was it. The sacrifice. I looked at the flare gun in my left hand. I had one shot left. I wasn't going to waste it on a zombie. I looked at the emergency oxygen bypass valve on the side of the SAT chamber. It was a brass fitting, designed to allow external tanks to feed the chamber in case of a primary system failure. If I could blow that valve, the pressure differential would do the rest. It would either blast the door open or kill everyone inside. I didn't have the luxury of morality anymore. I was a man of the deep, and the deep only had one rule: survive. I jammed the flare gun against the brass valve and pulled the trigger. The explosion was small, but the magnesium flare burned at 5,000 degrees. The brass didn't just break, it liquefied. A jet of high-pressure air screamed out of the hole, a horizontal geyser that sliced through the nearest zombie like a laser. The internal pressure of the chamber began to drop rapidly. Inside, I heard the muffled screams of the people as their ears popped and their lungs strained. The door, no longer held shut by the immense pressure differential, groaned. I shoved my wrench into the gap and heaved. My muscles screamed. My vision went black for a second as a bubble of nitrogen hit my optic nerve. But then, the seal broke. With a roar of escaping gas, the hatch swung open. The force of the decompression threw the zombies back, scattering them across the deck like autumn leaves. I tumbled inside, the heavy metal door slamming shut behind me as I fell into the small, cramped airlock. I didn't wait. I crawled to the inner control panel, my fingers fumbling with the oversized buttons. I hit the rapid recompression sequence. The air hissed, a deafening roar as the chamber began to fill with a helium-oxygen mix. The pressure pushed back against my skin, pinning the nitrogen bubbles in place, stopping the clock. I lay there on the cold steel floor, gasping, my suit feeling like a lead coffin. Through the porthole of the inner door, I saw the woman who had tried to lock me out. She was huddled in the corner of the main chamber, her nose bleeding from the sudden pressure drop, staring at me with eyes that knew I was no longer a savior. But I wasn't looking at her. I was looking past her, out the far window of the saturation complex toward the bridge. The Undine was drifting. We were headed straight for the crest of Orion, a massive oil production platform that was currently a pillar of fire in the middle of the Gulf. The ship hit the rig with a force that threw me against the wall. The sound was like the world breaking in half. Metal shrieked on metal. The saturation chamber, bolted to the deck, held for a moment, then the weld snapped. We weren't a ship anymore. We were a pile of scrap metal sliding into the sea. I felt the sensation of falling. The chamber, weighted and reinforced, slid off the listing deck of the Undine and plummeted into the water. The sun vanished. The screams of the dying ship were replaced by the muffled, rhythmic thumping of the ocean. I was back in the dark. I checked my depth gauge as the chamber began its slow, tumbling descent back into the abyss. 50 feet. 100. 200. The woman in the chamber with me was screaming, her voice high and thin in the helium-rich air, sounding like a panicked bird. I reached up and slowly unlatched my helmet. The air that hit my face was metallic and dry, but it was pressurized. My joints stopped aching. The fire in my lungs dimmed to a dull ember. I pulled the helmet off, my matted hair dripping with sweat. I looked at the woman. She was cowering, watching me like I was the monster. Maybe I was. I had doomed everyone on that ship to save myself. I had turned a sanctuary into a diving bell. "Shut up," I whispered, my voice a gravelly rasp. "We're going back down." The chamber hit something, a ledge, a piece of the rig, I didn't know. We stopped at 300 feet, swaying in the current. Through the reinforced viewport, I could see the flickering orange light from the burning rig above, filtered through the blue-black water. Shadows moved in the light, thousands of them. The things from the deep were rising to meet the things falling from the surface. I picked up my pipe wrench. The flare gun was empty, but the suit was still intact. I looked at the woman, then at the hatch. The pressure was equalized now. We were at 300 feet. If I opened that door, the ocean would come in, but so would I. A pale, bloated face pressed against the glass of the viewport. It wasn't a zombie. Not yet. It was a man, his eyes wide, his lungs clearly burst from the fall. He tapped on the glass, a rhythmic, desperate clink clink clink. Then, something much larger, something with far too many limbs and a skin that pulsed with bioluminescent malice, drifted out of the shadows behind him. It opened a mouth that looked like a jagged tear in reality and swallowed the man whole. I leaned my head against the cold steel of the chamber wall. I had survived the surface. I had survived the depths. But as the creature turned its glowing, hungry eyes toward our little metal bubble, I realized that the Gulf of Mexico wasn't a graveyard. It was a larder. And I was the only thing left on the menu that was still warm. I gripped the wrench and looked at the woman. "Can you weld?" I asked. She just stared at me, trembling. "Good," I said, standing up, the weight of the suit no longer a burden in the waterboard environment. "Then stay out of my way. I've got work to do." I reached for the manual override. The ticking clock hadn't stopped, it had just changed its tune. The oxygen scrubbers were humming, the pressure was holding, but the battery on the emergency lights was flickering. In 10 minutes, it would be pitch black. In 10 minutes, the things outside would figure out how to peel this can open. I stepped toward the hatch. I wasn't a welder anymore. I wasn't a survivor. I was a ghost in a tin suit, and I was tired of being hunted. "Welcome to the bottom of the world," I muttered, more to myself than her. "Let's see if you bastards can bleed." I threw the lever, and the ocean rushed in to meet me. The water didn't just rush in, it slammed into me like a freight train made of ice and liquid lead. For a heartbeat, the world was nothing but a deafening roar and a violent, swirling chaos of silt and darkness. My suit, weighing hundreds of pounds on the surface but designed to be neutral in the deep, felt like it was being crumpled by a giant's hand as the pressure equalized. The seals groaned, a high-pitched, metallic shriek that vibrated through my very teeth, but they held. I was no longer a man breathing air in a room. I was a pressurized organism, a biological component of a diving system, submerged in the crushing weight of 500 feet of Gulf water. The emergency lights on the interior of the habitat flickered one last time, casting a dying orange glow on the woman I'd left behind. She was pressed against the far bulkhead, her eyes wide, hands clawing at the metal as the water rose past her waist, then her chest. I didn't look back. If I looked back, I'd try to save her, and there was no saving anyone anymore. The manual override stayed down, the outer hatch swinging wide into the abyss, and I stepped out. The ocean outside wasn't empty. It was a thick, viscous soup of gore and sediment. My helmet lights cut through the murk in two narrow, vibrating lances of white. The first thing I saw wasn't a fish or a piece of debris. It was a face. It was Thompson, the shift lead who'd been missing for 3 days. His skin was the color of a fish's belly, milky, translucent, and stretched so tight over his skull that the bone was beginning to poke through. But it wasn't the pressure that had done it. His jaw had been dislocated, unhinged like a snake's, and a cluster of bioluminescent, worm-like filaments were writhing out of his throat, pulsing with a rhythmic, sickly violet light. He wasn't floating. He was swimming. He moved with a jerky, unnatural grace, his limbs snapping into positions no human joint should allow. Behind him, dozens more drifted out of the shadows of the rig's massive structural legs. They were the crew of the Pinnacle 7, or what was left of them. They looked like a graveyard that had decided to go for a stroll. I raised the heavy, industrial-grade arc welder in my right hand and the oversized pipe wrench in my left. The welder was connected to the suit's internal power pack by a reinforced umbilical, a tether to my only chance at a weapon. I squeezed the trigger. A spark of brilliant blue light hissed into existence, boiling the water around the tip. The sound was a low, electric thrum that resonated in my chest. "Come on then," I hissed, the sound of my own breath ragged and wet in the confined space of the helmet. Thompson, or the thing wearing his skin, lunged. It didn't swim like a person, it propelled itself with sudden, explosive contractions of its torso, like a squid. It slammed into my chest plate, the force of the impact sending me reeling back against the habitat's outer hull. The sound was like a hammer hitting a bell. My HUD flashed red, warning me of a structural integrity drop in the chest seals. The thing's fingers, now tipped with jagged, calcified protrusions, scraped against my faceplate, leaving deep gouges in the reinforced acrylic. I didn't think. I reacted. I swung the wrench with the full weight of the suit's hydraulic-assisted arm. The heavy steel caught the creature in the side of the head. In the deep, sound travels 5 times faster than in air, and the crack of its skull shattering was like a gunshot next to my ear. Dark, oily fluid, too thick to be blood, exploded into the water. But it didn't stop. It didn't even flinch. The thing just turned its shattered face back to me, the violet filaments in its throat glowing brighter, lashing out to latch onto my helmet's air intake. I jammed the arc welder into its open maw. The discharge was blinding. A sphere of white-hot plasma erupted between us, vaporizing a pocket of water instantly. The creature's head didn't just burn, it cooked from the inside out, the pressure of the expanding steam causing its eyes to pop like grapes. It went limp, drifting away into the dark, but the smell, oh God, the smell, even through the scrubbers, the scent of charred rotten meat and ozone filled my nose. I didn't have time to celebrate. The others were closing in. They weren't mindless. They were working together, circling me, staying just out of the reach of my lights. I could see their glows, dozens of violet pinpricks in the blackness, like stars in a nightmare. I started to move. My goal was the moon pool, 300 feet along the horizontal support strut. If I could get there, I could reach the emergency submersible. But the strut was a gauntlet. The rig was dying, the massive steel beams were groaning under the weight of the infection. That's when I noticed it. The rig wasn't just covered in rust and barnacles anymore. There was a growth, a dark, pulsating carpet of biomass that looked like muscle tissue, weaving itself around the steel. The Pinnacle 7 wasn't just a platform. It was being turned into a skeleton for something much larger. As I trekked along the strut, my boots magnetic locking with every heavy step, the twist revealed itself. I looked down into the trench below, the deep void we'd been drilling into. We hadn't hit oil. We had pierced a vein. Far below, a gargantuan shape was shifting. It was a mass of fused bodies, thousands of them, woven together by those same violet filaments into a singular, mountain-sized organism. It was a biological engine, and the rig's drill string was its straw. We weren't extracting resources. It was feeding on us, using the drill pipe to pump its cellular slurry up to the surface. The outbreak wasn't an accident. It was a harvest. My radio crackled to life. It wasn't the woman. It wasn't the surface. It was a voice that sounded like grinding rocks, a cacophony of 1,000 different tones layered over one another. Ghost, in the tin. I froze. The voice wasn't coming from the speakers. It was vibrating through the hull of my suit, transmitted through the water itself. The pressure is a womb. Suddenly, the water around me began to churn. The drowned stopped their circling. They moved aside, making a path. Something was coming up from the trench, moving with a speed that defied the laws of fluid dynamics. It was a new mutation, something the size of a great white, but shaped like a flayed human torso with a dozen elongated, whip-like arms. Its skin was transparent, revealing a nervous system that glowed with a blinding, strobe-like intensity. This was the project manager. It hit me before I could raise the welder. One of its translucent limbs wrapped around my waist, and I felt the steel of my suit begin to buckle. The pressure alarm screamed in my ear, 600 feet. 700 feet. The thing was pulling me down, dragging me away from the rig and toward the gaping, fleshy maw of the trench. I was being taken to the heart of the hive. My lungs burned. The oxygen mix was getting toxic as the depth increased. My vision began to tunnel, the edges of the HUD blurring into a smear of red and black. I was at my breaking point. My muscles were screaming, my ribs felt like they were about to cave in from the external pressure, and the sheer existential terror of being swallowed by the ocean was clawing at my mind. But then I saw it. Attached to my utility belt was the emergency thermite charge we used for cutting through seized wellheads. It was a Hail Mary, in a canister. I couldn't reach it with my hands. The creature's limbs had pinned my arms to my sides. I was a passenger in my own coffin. I looked at the creature's face, a smooth, featureless expanse of gelatinous flesh with a single, massive eye that looked too much like a human's. I bit down on the emergency manual release for my right arm's hydraulic lock. The pain was astronomical as the suit's internal mechanism snapped my collarbone to free the limb, but the arm moved. I reached for the thermite. "Welcome to the bottom," I choked out, blood spitting onto the inside of my faceplate. I didn't just prime the charge. I jammed it into the gap between my suit's power pack and the creature's grip. If this went off, the suit's lithium-ion core would go with it. It wouldn't just be an explosion, it would be a small sun appearing at the bottom of the gulf. The creature seemed to realize. Its eye widened. The violet light in its veins turned a frantic, jagged red. "We are eternal," the voice rumbled through my bones. "Then you're gonna love how long this hurts," I whispered. I triggered the sequence. The world turned white. Not the white of light, but the white of pure, unadulterated heat. The water around me flash boiled, creating a cavitation bubble that expanded with the force of a tectonic shift. I felt my suit being hurled backward, the shockwave shattering my ribs and collapsing one of my lungs. I was a pebble in a hurricane. The last thing I saw before the darkness took me was the trench. The thermite hadn't just killed the creature, it had ignited the oil, the flammable, biological slurry the organism was pumping. A pillar of fire, impossible and terrifying, erupted from the seabed, a line of gold and crimson tearing through the black water, racing up the drill string toward the surface like a fuse. I was drifting now. My suit was dead. My power was gone. The lights were out. I was falling into the abyss, away from the fire, away from the rig. The silence was absolute, save for the wet, rhythmic thumping of my own failing heart. I was 800 feet down. The surface was 1,000 miles away, a dream of a world that was likely already burning. But as the fire from the trench illuminated the depths, I saw them. Not dozens. Not hundreds. Thousands. A vertical forest of the drowned, all rising from the silt, their violet lights flickering on in unison. They weren't coming for me. They were ascending. The explosion hadn't stopped the harvest, it had triggered the final stage. The oil wasn't just food. It was an accelerant. The fire I'd started was the signal. I closed my eyes, the cold finally seeping through the cracked seals of my suit. The pressure was a heavy blanket, a final embrace. I had survived the outbreak, but as I sank deeper into the dark, watching the army of the dead float toward the world of the living. I realized that surviving was the easy part. The hard part was being the only one left to watch the world end from the bottom up. My oxygen alarm gave one final, mournful chirp and fell silent. I waited for the squeeze. I waited for the end. But in the dark, a hand, a cold, wet human hand, grabbed my faceplate. I opened my eyes. It was the woman. She was out of the habitat. She had no suit. She had no tank. Her skin was translucent, her jaw was unhinged, and her eyes were glowing with a soft, beautiful violet light. She didn't kill me. She pressed her forehead against mine, the acrylic of the helmet the only thing between us. "Don't worry," her voice echoed in my skull, clear as a bell. "The water is fine." And then, she began to pull me up. Not to save me. Not to kill me. But to bring me to the surface, so I could see what we had become. I wasn't a welder anymore. I wasn't a ghost. I was the first of the new world, and the sun was about to go out forever. The pressure didn't kill me. It should have. By all the laws of physics and the brutal mathematics of the deep, the rapid ascent should have turned my blood into a frothing soup of nitrogen bubbles, shattering my capillaries and exploding my lungs like overinflated balloons. But as the woman, if she could still be called that, pulled me upward, her grip on my helmet was like a vice of cold, impossible strength. I felt the bends begin to take hold, a screaming agony in my joints, a white-hot poker stabbing into my brain. But then the violet light from her eyes leaked into me. It didn't just illuminate the dark water. It bled through the acrylic faceplate, through my skin, and into my veins. It was cold, colder than the abyssal currents, but it acted as a stabilizer, a psychic anchor that held my shattering biology together. We surged through the layers of the ocean, a reverse fall through the history of the world. We passed the graveyard of the mid-depths where the light begins to fail, past the shattered remains of the pipe-laying sleds, and past the bloated, drifting corpses of the surface world that had finally begun to sink into the quiet dark. They were everywhere now, a rain of the dead, falling like snow. But they weren't rotting. Their skin was turning that same translucent, pearlescent gray. Their eyes were beginning to flicker with that low, violet ember. The virus, or the evolution, whatever it was, wasn't just a terrestrial plague. It was a terrestrial harvest, and the ocean was the processing plant. As we breached the 300-foot mark, the pressure inside my suit began to scream against the decreasing pressure of the exterior. My lungs felt like they were filled with crushed glass. I tried to scream, to beg her to stop, to let me decompress. But my voice was a dry rattle in a helmet filled with carbon dioxide and the smell of my own fear. She didn't look back. She just kept swimming, her body moving with a fluid, eel-like grace that defied human anatomy. Her spine seemed longer, her limbs more flexible, her fingers webbed with a fine, shimmering membrane. We hit the thermocline, the sudden shift in temperature, and the shock of it nearly stopped my heart. And then the light changed. It wasn't the dim, murky green of the Gulf anymore. It was a chaotic, hellish orange. We were nearing the surface. The woman slowed her ascent, not for my sake, but to let the horror of the world above truly sink in. I looked up through the shimmering ceiling of the water. The surface was on fire. Great slicks of crude oil from the ruptured rigs were burning in massive, undulating blankets of flame, casting a flickering, demonic light down into the depths. Shadows moved within the fire, shattered hulls of ships, the skeletal remains of the apex rig, and the silhouettes of things that were no longer human standing on the edges of the burning debris. With one final, violent surge, we broke the surface. The sound hit me first, a deafening roar of wind, fire, and the high-pitched, rhythmic shrieking of 1,000 voices calling out in a language that felt like a vibration in my marrow. I coughed, the sudden change in pressure forcing a spray of blood against the inside of my faceplate. I was gasping, the air of the surface world tasting of ash, sulfur, and the metallic tang of old blood. I expected to see a rescue fleet, or maybe the empty silence of a dead world. What I saw was worse. The Gulf was a graveyard of steel. The deep-water apex was a blackened husk, its massive derrick buckled like a broken spine. The surrounding waters were clogged with lifeboats, debris, and thousands upon thousands of people. But they weren't drowning. They were standing. They were treading water with impossible endurance, or perched on the floating wreckage, all of them turned toward the horizon. Their skin was the color of a drowned moon, and their violet eyes lit the smoke-choked air like a sea of fallen stars. The woman hauled me onto a floating section of the habitat's upper deck, her movements effortless despite the weight of my dive suit. She stood over me, her unhinged jaw clicking back into place with a wet, sickening sound. She wasn't just a monster, she was a herald. I lay there, my lungs burning, my vision blurring. I tried to reach for the emergency release on my helmet, my fingers fumbling with the heavy brass locking ring. I needed air. I needed to see. My hands shook, the heavy welding gloves feeling like lead weights. With a sudden, violent hiss, the seal broke. The pressure equalized with a pop that made my ears bleed, and the helmet slid off, clattering against the rusted metal. I sucked in the air, and it felt like inhaling needles. The sun I had seen from below wasn't the sun at all. The sky was a bruised, sickly purple, occluded by a cloud layer so thick and swirling that it looked like a ceiling of granite. The sun was a pale, flickering ghost behind the smog, looking like a dying light bulb at the end of a long hallway. The world was cold. A freezing wind whipped across the burning oil, carrying the scent of the deep sea, the scent of salt, rot, and something ancient. "Look!" the woman whispered, though her lips didn't move. The voice was in my head, a resonance that bypassed my ears. I looked toward the horizon, toward the distant Texas coastline. The cities weren't dark. They were glowing. Great pillars of violet light were erupting from the urban centers, reaching up to touch the heavy clouds. It looked like a circuit board being powered up for the first time. "The old fire is burning out," she said, her translucent hand touching my shoulder. Her touch didn't feel cold anymore. It felt like the only warm thing left in the universe. "The world of the sun is over. We were the dream the earth had while it slept. Now it is awake." I struggled to my feet, my legs wobbling under the unfamiliar weight of gravity. My suit, my armor against the abyss, now felt like a cage. I looked at my hands. The skin under my fingernails was turning dark. The veins in my wrists were beginning to glow with a faint, pulsing violet. The pain in my joints was gone, replaced by a strange, humming lightness. I wasn't dying. I was being rebuilt. I looked at the thousands of people in the water. They weren't fighting. They weren't eating each other. They were waiting. They were a hive, a single organism preparing for the long dark. And then I saw them. From the smoke emerged a squadron of black shapes, military gunships, the last remnants of the old world's dying breath. They came screaming across the water, their searchlights cutting through the gloom, their chain guns spinning. They didn't see people. They saw a plague. They saw us. The first volley of fire tore into the water, turning the calm surface into a chaotic froth of white foam and red blood. One of the gunships tilted, its nose dipping as it raked the floating debris with lead. The bullets thudded into the metal deck around me, sparks dancing in the twilight. I dove for cover behind a buckled winch, my welder's instincts screaming at me to hide, to survive. But the woman didn't move. She stood at the edge of the deck, her arms spread wide, her violet eyes flaring with a sudden, blinding intensity. As the gunship roared overhead, she let out a sound, not a scream, but a pulse. A low-frequency thrum that shook the very air. Across the water, thousands of others joined in. The sound was a physical weight, a wall of resonance that hit the helicopters like a gale. Their electronics flickered and died. Their rotors sputtered. One by one, the birds of war began to fall from the sky, their engines choked by the sudden, unnatural thickening of the atmosphere. They crashed into the burning oil slicks, adding their own funeral pyres to the landscape. I watched a pilot struggle out of a sinking cockpit, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. He looked at the things in the water, the pale, glowing survivors, and he didn't swim for his life. He pulled his sidearm, screaming a silent prayer, and put the barrel in his mouth. He knew. Even in his terror, he knew that the world he belonged to was already a ghost. The woman turned back to me, her face unreadable, yet filled with a terrifying sort of peace. "They fight because they think the light is life," she said. "They don't understand that the light is what blinded us. The dark is where we see." She reached out and took my hand. Her skin was wet, but it felt like silk. She led me to the edge of the deck. Below us, the water was teeming. The people, the new people, were beginning to dive. They weren't staying on the surface. They were going down. They were heading for the rigs, for the underwater habitats, for the trenches where the pressure would crush a normal man. They were reclaiming the 70% of the planet we had only ever peeked at through windows and titanium hulls. I looked back at the burning horizon one last time. I thought about my wife. I thought about the house with the white fence and the garden that needed weeding. I realized that those things weren't just gone, they were irrelevant. They were the artifacts of a species that had reached its limit. We were the next step. We were the things that could survive the collapse. We were the deep-sea welders of a new reality, destined to build a civilization in the ruins of the abyss. "The sun is going out," I whispered, my own voice sounding strange to me, vibrating with that same melodic hum. I looked up at the pale disk in the sky. It was shrinking, fading into the violet haze. It wasn't an eclipse. It was my eyes. My pupils were expanding, my retinas shifting to catch the spectrum of the deep. The world of color and heat was washing away into a beautiful, monochromatic silver. The fire on the oil was no longer orange, it was a dull, flickering gray. The only thing that had color was the water. The water was a deep, vibrant, electric indigo. "It's time to go home," she said. I didn't hesitate. I didn't look for a lifeboat. I didn't pray for a rescue that would never come. I stepped off the edge of the rusted steel. For a second, I was weightless, suspended between the dying sky and the living ocean. Then I hit the water. The impact should have been cold, should have been jarring, but it felt like a homecoming. It felt like sliding into a warm bed after a lifetime of exhaustion. I didn't hold my breath. I let the indigo water fill my lungs. It didn't burn. It didn't drown me. It pulsed through me, a liquid oxygen that fueled a heart that was beating slower, stronger, more efficiently. We sank together, the woman and I, leaving the fire and the screaming behind. As we descended, the sounds of the surface world faded into a blissful, heavy silence. The pressure began to mount, but instead of crushing me, it felt like a firm, reassuring embrace. We passed the 200-foot mark, the 400-foot mark. I saw the deep water apex from below again, but it didn't look like a wreck anymore. It looked like a skeleton, a foundation. There were hundreds of others there now, working. They were using their hands, their new strength, to strip the steel, to weave the cables, to create something new. They were welding without torches, using the bioluminescent energy that pulsed from their own skin to fuse the metal together. It was a city. An underwater hive that would stretch across the ocean floor, safe from the storms, safe from the radiation of the dying sun, safe from the madness of the land. I looked down into the great trench, the place I had feared my entire life. It was no longer a void. It was a cathedral. Thousands of violet lights moved in the depths, a galaxy of new souls reclaiming the planet from the bottom up. I felt a pang of grief, a final, flickering spark of the man who had been a welder from Galveston. A man who loved the smell of grilled meat and the sound of a baseball game on the radio. But then the violet light in my brain surged, and that man drifted away like a piece of flotsam. I wasn't him anymore. He had died in that habitat, 500 feet down, gasping for air that didn't exist. I was something else. I was the first of the deep. I was the guardian of the trench. The woman squeezed my hand and pointed down, deeper than I had ever dared to go. There, in the absolute dark, a great structure was beginning to rise, a tower made of bone and steel and the glass of the seafloor. It was beautiful. It was terrifying. It was our future. As we swam toward it, I felt the last of the surface world's warmth leave my body. I was cold. I was wet. I was a monster. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of the dark. The sun had finally gone out, and in the eternal night of the deep, we were finally, horribly, perfectly awake. The world didn't end with a bang or a whimper. It ended with a breath of salt water and a flicker of violet light. And as the heavy silt of the abyss settled over the ruins of humanity, I knew that the hardest part wasn't watching the world end. It was realizing that, for us, this was only the beginning of a very, very long night.